based on an archaeological find, not the book that's the children's books that I'm doing, right? And so I've been trying to work on that lately. And because I've been trying to work on that lately, I haven't really been in here because I'm trying to, focus on making sure that I'm doing a couple of different things. Um, Try to share this in a different way, and it is now very confusing. I'm now very confused. Not that it's really hard for me to get very confused, right? So um, I'm hoping that the last week has treated everybody well and that everybody is doing okay. I know that it's been a really difficult week for many people. There's a lot of shit going on in the world right now that is really hard to deal with and really hard to actually watch, actually, have interacting. There's a lot of trauma that's going on that is really hard for people, especially people who have dealt with a lot of trauma in their lives. It's very hard to watch other people go through similar trauma and, not be able to do a whole lot about it. And so I'm hoping that, everybody kind of dealing with that is, staying in as positive space as they can and making sure that they're giving themselves grace and they're giving themselves, that thought process of positivity and or self positivity, right? Giving themselves some grace and some love within it because it's just not easy to deal with, right? It's not easy to have gone through a lot of trauma and then watch as children are traumatized, right? Especially if you have compassion and empathy, it's an extremely difficult space to be in right now. And so I'm really hoping that everybody is giving themselves the grace that we all deserve as, loving, compassionate individuals. I'm really hoping that people are finding a space and a way to actually, take care of themselves as well in a time when we desperately wish that we could be taking care of others, and it's a little bit impossible to do on some levels, right? So I wanted to go ahead and come in today and talk again on European ancestry. I'll probably I've been back and forth on what to talk about a lot lately, just because of the fact that it's been a little bit difficult for me. I really want to be able to spread awareness on some of the things that are going on, and yet I also have focuses that I need to be working towards. And so I've been a little bit back and forth on that. And so I'll probably switch us back up to paleoanthropology with the next couple of lives, at least for a while, and then switch back and forth. Um, just because I want to make sure that, what is getting out there and what's needed to go out there is getting out there right, and not actually, being missed over or skipped. And that I'm not staying in my lane, but making sure that I'm doing the things that I need to do because sometimes it's very hard, I feel, to remember that. That the things that we think are going to fix it aren't necessarily going to fix things, that there's a deeper level of understanding that needs to be had on a global scale, right? Like electing a new president isn't going to fix the problems. Changing the entire structure is what needs to be done to fix the problems, right? And so just trying to work within that space and that understanding. Um, and try and make sure that I stay on the focus point of what I'm trying to do to make that happen. And again, as well, working with the book that I'm working on and working on the grave site that I'm working on. So we'll see. Probably be paleoanth next, though. Just because, well, I want to focus on decolonization for European heritage and trying to find ancestry in a positive way. I also want to make sure that we're getting that earlier thought process as well, just because that earlier thought process needs to be thought of on a global scale, right? That animistic thought process on a global scale and taking us back a little bit further on a global scale. So hopefully I won't have to turn off comments today. It looks like we're actually staying pretty low. And as long as we stay pretty low, it has a tendency to not be pretty nasty in the comments. If you are new to my lives, let me go ahead and start off with what I try and start off with. My name is Witta. I'm an archaeologist, an anthropologist, a historian, a storyteller, and a healer. I have degrees in medicine and degrees in anthropology. I come to TikTok to teach base level education on things that most people aren't getting a base level education on because public schools aren't teaching it. And most people think of it as a college level knowledge. And I don't think it should be gate kept behind $40,000 a year paywalls. And I don't think that it should be gate kept with language that is very hard for a lot of people to understand, even with extensive degrees. I'll go through things where I have to look up every other word in a paragraph, and I'm like, I have an extensive vocabulary. Why? So I come onto TikTok to try and teach and try and give some base level education. Healer, yes, I've been healing since I was very young. I learned healing as a toddler walking behind my mother. So uh, this to me is also a healing thing. Archaeology and anthropology and the things that I teach are also for healing, right? To me, they're about healing because healing is not just the body, right? Healing is also the soul and the understanding and the mind. Um, and yes, I have healed broken bones. I could stitch you up if I needed to. Um, so when I come into TikTok, it is to teach, it is to give an education. I do a lot of writing. I've been publishing books. I'm trying to publish another book. Um, I, sorry, my train of thought. ADD doesn't always work very well for me. So with that, that's one of the reasons that I come into TikTok. The other reason that I come into TikTok is what we're talking about today. As I've been asked by many members of the different communities that I belong to help Europeans find their own ancestry. Many European allies out there are looking to reconnect to their own ancestry without appropriation of other people's cultures. And so, in an effort to help allies and accomplices reconnect to their own ancestry without appropriation of other cultures, I am doing my best to teach them what I know about European ancestry so that they can reconnect without appropriating of other cultures. Um, I frequently in my lives go over how the theory of race was debunked, and I'm sure that we'll go over how the theory of race was debunked today. My field is the field that created the theory of race as an atrocious or as a justification for the atrocities that they were committing. My field is also the one who debunked the theory of race, and because my field is the one that debunked the theory of race, it's important for me to make sure that people understand the debunction of the theory of race, the fact that race itself does not exist. That being said, I really don't deal well with racism within my chat. I would appreciate it if you take racism out of my chat. The other thing is I don't deal well with phobias based on religion, desire, or gender. Um, I also don't want to talk about your God or deal with your God. Your God's a icky, and I don't like the warmongering narcissists that so many people follow. That does not mean that I'm okay with anti-Semitism or Islamophobia in my chat. There are three biological sexes, male, female, and intersex. And so your concept of what people should identify as doesn't matter. You can identify however you want. You don't get to tell other people how they identify. Gender is how we self-identify. It has nothing to do with what somebody else's perception of us is. So keep your phobias based on gender out of my chat. And desire is the same way. You don't get to tell anybody what they're allowed to desire or not desire unless, of course, they're harming people in that desire. So keep your phobias based on religion, gender, and desire out of my chat. TikTok gives everybody with 1,000 followers their own space to go live. You are all welcome to go live if you can get 1,000 followers, and you're welcome to set whatever boundaries you want in your own live. These are the boundaries that I set for my live. So, again, I don't want to deal with your racism. I don't want to deal with your phobias based on religion, gender, and desire, and I don't want to deal with your God. So with that, let's go ahead and get started a little bit. Obviously, the person behind me might be surprising to some people as being European, right? The person behind me, if you stick around, there will be information on Northern European as well. The person behind me is from 30 to 40,000 years ago, or taken from that time period. This is a Gravatian. The Gravatians are not the first Homo sapiens to live in Europe. They are the first Homo sapiens to live in Europe in a time frame where there's not any other humans, or if there are other humans, they're not usually in the same spaces. And this is because as we move into Europe with the Neanderthals initially at 50,000 years ago. So by 30,000 years ago is the very last of the Neanderthals, but by 40,000 years ago, we see that they're gone from most spaces, right? So um, let's go over some definitions really quick first. So let's go over what immigration, migration, and colonization means. These are three different verbs, three different actions, three different words that mean three different things. If somebody is migrating into a space, that space doesn't have other people in it, or they're migrating in a yearly pattern where they move into a space every season and they utilize the needs of their community with the needs of that season. So if somebody is migrating into a space that doesn't have other people, that is not immigration or colonization. Immigration is moving into a space that already has inhabitants within that space and becoming a part of the culture, right, that is already there. So if somebody immigrates to the United States, say, they come into the United States, they become a citizen of the United States, they maybe join the politics within the United States, send their children to school within the United States, they become a part of the culture. This is what immigration means. Colonization is moving into a space that is already occupied and imposing your culture and your government on the people who already have a culture and a government. Colonization usually is done in usually is done violently because nobody wants to be erased. Nobody wants their culture to be erased. Nobody wants their people to be erased. So when you're looking at colonization, what you're looking at is moving into a space that is already occupied and replacing the government and the culture with your own government and culture, again, done through violence. So there are many people who have migrated across the planet. There are many people who are immigrant from across the planet. Colonization is a completely different thing. People during this time period are not colonizing. They are either immigrating or migrating. Now, why do I say that they're either immigrating or migrating? I say that they're either immigrating or migrating because at this time period, when people are moving out of the Levant area up into Western Europe, they are moving into a space that has Neanderthals already living within it. Now, they've been living with Neanderthals for about 100,000 years, the Levant area, two caves side by side, 5-minute walk from each other, lots of interchange of ideas and genetics, right? So as they're moving into a space that has Neanderthals within it, they're already taking some of the Neanderthal culture that they've already learned from the Neanderthals with them, and they're moving in and adapting into the area that Neanderthals are in, and they're adapting to Neanderthal culture and Neanderthal understanding within this thought process and within this space. So this is immigration or migration. They are moving into an area where Neanderthals are not already present. So when we look at the Gravachians, what we see is a group of people who, from the start, are yes, we do have information on what the Neanderthal culture was like to some extent. Um, so as we're moving into a space where Neanderthals are already at, this is us immigrating into a space, right? And if we're moving into a space where Neanderthals are not at, maybe they've been driven down by the Ice Age and they're along the southern portion of Europe along the Mediterranean, or maybe after the end of the last ice age, Gravachians moving up, Neanderthals already being gone. This is migration into space. None of these things are colonization. There is an entirely different thing. So for it to have been colonization, there would have to be people already there, and Homo sapiens would have to be moving into the area and taking over the culture. They would have to be taking over the government. They would have to be being violent to the people that are already there. And we do not have any evidence of Homo sapiens being violent to Neanderthals. So we are not looking at colonization. What we are looking at is immigration and migration. Now, that's something that's important to understand, right? I know when I started studying history, and well, I started studying history a long time ago, but when I started studying how we're moving out of the Levant area into Europe, and I started looking at this, I'm like, shit, have we always been colonizers? Is colonizing just what Homo sapiens do, or that's who we are? I had to go and take a look at what the definitions were. And then I also had to go and take a look at what was actually going on during that time period. And what we see during that time period is not colonization. In spaces where there are already other humans, because anything that has a genus Homo, like Homo neanderthal and Homo denisovan and Homo sapien, anything that has a genus Homo is a human. Homo means human in Latin. So anybody who is human within that space, they're not killing them off. they're not taking over their culture, they're not taking over their government, and they're not replacing it. So we are not looking at colonization. What we are looking at is migration, immigration. Now, it's important to understand that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals have been living together since before Homo sapien became a species whole. We know now within the last year that our understanding of speciation for Homo sapiens has changed. We've thought for a long time that all species come through what we call isolation and adaptation. So you're isolated from the rest of your species and you're in a space and you adapt within that space. And that adaptation through 100,000 years of isolation means that you become a new species that's separate from this different species. Now we know that the people of that the Homo sapiens are developed through the. So let me go over a definition again. We have tribe and band. A lot of people want to associate tribe with tribal or the idea of being primitive or the idea of a specific way of life. But the word tribe does not mean a specific way of life. What the word tribe means is a community whose citizenship is based on genetic lineage. A band is a community whose citizenship is not based on genetic lineage. So the United States is a band. It is not a community based on genetic lineage. You can apply for citizenship. You can be born here, even though your genes aren't from here. You can be a citizen of the United States without having a genetic connection to prior citizens of the United States. A tribe would be like Israel, where your ability to be a citizen of the Judaic community is based on your lineage. Are you born to Judaic parents, right? So, tribe is a community based on genetic lineage, band is a community not based on genetic lineage. Early Homo sapiens are speciating in bands of other humans. So what we see is that Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo ancestor, Homo ergaster, these ancestors of who we are living in bands. And an ancestor and erectus have a baby, and that baby looks like a Homo sapien. And maybe an ancestor and an ergaster have a baby, and that baby looks like a Homo sapien. Now, of course, they don't look at that baby and go, oh, that's a Homo sapien, and I'm an ergaster. They look at that baby and they go, oh my God, my cute little baby. And that cute little baby looks at their parents and goes, oh my God, that's mommy and daddy. They don't look at their parents and go, oh my God, that's an ergaster and an ancestor, right? Grandma's a Homo erectus. They don't look at it like that. So we now know that our method of speciation is very unique. This has been long thought of as a theoretical method of speciation, and it's called speciation through convergence. It is many different species breeding together that creates Homo sapiens. Speciation through convergence, right? So when we see speciation through convergence for Homo sapiens, this prior thought of method of speciation, we see that we find that Homo sapiens start. Our earliest Homo sapien find is in Morocco at 300,000 years ago. And then we have another within the next 50,000 years in Ethiopia, and then another in South Africa within the next 50,000 years as well. So we see that our earliest Homo sapiens are speciating from convergence in different parts of Africa, right? So this is starting at 300,000 years ago. Roughly 125,000 years ago to 135,000 years ago, all the different Homo sapiens in these different pockets come together and form Homo sapien as a species. We become our species, our own species. We're not just the children of other species, we're our own species. Okay. So before that, we see that Homo sapiens are already living in the Levant area with Neanderthals. Again, we see that Homo sapien is in the Levant area side by side with Neanderthals in two caves, a 5-minute walk from each other for roughly 100,000 years, from 150,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago. So when Homo sapiens are starting to leave the Levant area and move out of what is at the time actually Africa, because the mass glaciation means that the sea levels are lower, and because the sea levels are lower, the Arabian Peninsula is actually a part of Africa at this time. So when they're moving out of that upper northeast corner of Africa or the Levant area and up into Europe at this time, they're moving out, of course, as Homo sapiens. Homo sapien developing in Africa develops in some very specific ways for the environment that Homo sapien develops in. We develop very tall and very lean. The reason that we develop very tall and very lean is because the epidermis is the largest organ on your body, and one of its functions is to retain heat or to dissipate heat. We develop very tall and lean because having more skin dissipates heat easier. Okay. We develop in an area that has a lot of sun. And because we develop in an area that has a lot of sun, we develop with more condensation, tightly condensed melanin. So everybody on this planet, every human being around has melanin. Some of us have more dispersed melanin, and some of us have a tighter condension of our melanin. Okay. So those of us who have tighter condension of melanin are going to be darker skin, and those of us who have a more dispersed melanation to our skin are going to be lighter skin. And because we develop in an area where we have direct sun coming down on us, we develop with more condensed melanin in our skin as a species. Why do we do this? Because we're protecting ourselves. We're adapting to a region that has a lot of sun. So we develop as dark of skin. We also develop as dark of eyes. The color of your eyes is based on how much melanin you have in your eyes, just like your skin tone is based on how much condension of the melanin is. And I am Isaiah. You just got to listen for a minute. How much condension of the melanation is within your skin, right? So the same thing with your eyes. Dark eyes actually protect from the sun, so you can be in a high sun environment, okay? And not as much light gets into your eyes, so it doesn't blind you as much, right? The other thing that we develop with is tightly coiled hair. And the reason that we develop with tightly coiled hair, this is a study done by an amazing archaeologist and anthropologist who was a hairdresser before she did anthropology, who's a beautiful Black woman who has done studies on why we have tightly coiled hair in our speciation. And the reason that we have tightly coiled hair in our speciation is because it creates a shade over our head, and then it creates a lattice work for air to move through. And that lattice work for air to move through, right, creates the ability for our scalps to cool, so our brains cool. Okay. So because of this, we know that our species develops in Africa with dark skin, dark hair, and tightly coiled hair. Dark skin, dark eyes, and tightly coiled hair, right? So as we are living in the Levant area with Neanderthals and picking up those genes from genetics from Neanderthals, and some of us are going back into Africa, and some of our genetics are going up into Europe with the Neanderthals. Okay, we are developing further abilities to move into space. As we're moving out of Europe or out of the Levant area into Europe at 50,000 years ago, we're moving with Neanderthals, right? We are moving with the Neanderthals that we've been intermixed with as the ice levels are going away, right? As max glaciation is going away. And we're moving back into areas that Neanderthals have been in. It's back for them. We're moving into there for the first time. As we're moving into there for the first time, we're taking the knowledge, right, that we get from Neanderthals of how to interact and how to work within this space. We don't get light of skin until 5,000 years ago. We are dark of skin for the majority of the population until 5,000 years ago. We see that Neanderthals are on the lighter shade of skin. That does not mean that all Neanderthals are white. It means that Neanderthals are on the lighter scale of skin. Some Neanderthals are actually quite dark of skin. We see that Neanderthals, having developed in Europe, develop short and stocky because, again, long and lean dissipates heat. Short and stocky retains heat. They develop with a large nose and mid-face prognosis because it allows the air in and then it goes through all the sinuses before it hits the brain. So where we develop with tightly coiled hair to create a lattice work to cool our brain, they develop with this huge mid-face prognosis and this huge nose so that they can cool the air before or warm the air before it gets to the brain. The brain is so important to all of us, right? They also develop with lighter eyes. And the reason that they develop with lighter eyes is why we get light eyes before we get light skin. This is because light eyes are an adaptation to a low light environment. We have to be able to see the predators. We have to be able to see what's attacking us. And so light eyes are better because in the low light environment because they allow more light into the eyes. not better as in a whole, but better in a low light environment because they allow more light in. And so you can see better to see if the predators are attacking you. So, and 40 to 30,000 years ago, as Europeans, as the first of the Europeans moving into this space, as people who are moving in or have moved in with Neanderthals, and Neanderthals are now more a part of us than they are as a whole species, right? Because we have more Neanderthal DNA on this planet today than we ever did as Neanderthal being a species whole. Right? So as we are watching the Neanderthals become more a part of us and less of them, there's only about 10,000 of them when we actually meet up and start exchanging genetics. They've gone through two near annihilations of their species. They're so narrow genetically that they're actually um, inter, they're having children with their cousins or having children with their nieces or their uncles, right? Nibiru can take a step out. Ancient aliens theory is racist as fuck, and I don't want to deal with the ancient aliens theory that's racist as fuck, that says that if white people couldn't do it, black and brown people couldn't do it either. But the problem is that black and brown people have been doing shit longer than white people ever dreamed of it. Just is, just is, just is. And ancient aliens decides that if white people couldn't do it, there's no way black and brown people could do it. And that's just completely incorrect. Black and brown people held on to indigeneity and science way longer than Europeans did because Europeans let their religion eradicate the science that they had. So take your ancient aliens and your Nibiru out of my chat. So at 40 to 30,000 years ago, as the Neanderthals are no longer a major part of our culture, okay, we see that the Europeans during this time period are developing a culture that is for the first time a little bit different. What do we see? So first we should understand that we don't start burying our dead until after Neanderthals do. We also don't start painting caves until Neanderthals do. We also don't start decorating our body until Neanderthals do. The reason that we're not doing these things is because when we meet up with Neanderthals, they develop those thought processes and we develop those thought processes, right? At the same time. It is pronounced Neanderthal. Sometimes my 40 years of doing something reflects in the way my language reflects. And the 40-year-old Neanderthal or thal comes out instead of the tall, right? So we're seeing that as we are meeting up with Neanderthal, as we are coming together, we are starting to develop this concept of identity that is a little bit different than the concept of identity that we had before. So roughly 100,000 years ago, we start to see that in Neanderthal starts the first burial of dead, the first cave painting, the first decoration of self. And at the same time, we're seeing those things developing within us. We see them first within Neanderthal, but within 10,000 years, we start to see them within ourselves as well. And this is because Neanderthal and Homo sapien, so Homo neanderthalis and Homo sapien, both being human, because the genus Homo means human, are coming together. They're meeting something new. They've never seen each other. This is a new look for both of them, right? And because it's a new thing, they're like, oh, well, that's interesting. Not only that, but we see that every time Homo sapien comes across a different human, we fuck it and have kids with it. Because like we like things unusual. And if we're going to have babies with you, we like you to be a little bit more unusual. We also see that as sapien, well, any human actually, when two boxes collide, when two knowledges collide, when two ideas collide, new ideas spark out of that. When all you know is the lane that you've walked your entire life, it's very hard to have a new idea. When all I know over here is a lane that I've walked the entire life, it's very hard to have a new idea. Yet when these two lanes meet, right, when these two lanes come together, they spark new ideas, right? So being in your specific lane and never getting anything new is not healthy. It doesn't give us new things. We see this when we see that Homo sapien and Homo neanderthal meet for the first time. They start having new sparks of thought process, new ways of doing things. They change the tool usage that they do. They start burying their dead and things like that, right? So we are getting these things from our meetings with Neanderthal, whether they're developing them first or not, right? They're still getting those things from their meetings with us. It is that collision of brain cells, that collision of knowledge, that interaction that gives us both the ability to understand things on a newer level. So as we are in Europe at this point of time, we have, of course, already gotten these ideas of burial, of self identity, of art from our interactions. We've created our own knowledges on these. And now we're for the first time alone. For the first time in our entire, that is incorrect, freedom, there is actually Neanderthal DNA in all Africans prior to colonization, except for the Yoruba population and the Kwe population. The Yoruba population and the Kwe population have three what we call ghost species within their DNA. And ghost species are species that we see just little bits of their genetics in our DNA, but we haven't found them in the fossil record yet. All of that information is on my inwitaorg.com. You can actually find the archaeological and the DNA articles that show that information. Everybody on this planet has Neanderthal DNA, except for the Yoruba population of West Africa and the Kwe population of South Africa. And again, they have three ghost species within them. So when we see the Europeans within Europe at this time, we are seeing that they are, for the first time in their lives, living without others. They do not have other human beings around them for the first time. At this point, their entire 250,000 years have been led interacting with each other. Okay, have been led having other groups of humans around them. They come from many other groups of humans. You're talking mitochondrial DNA. There is a difference between mitochondrial DNA, which is based on a single chromosome, and the entirety of your genetics. There are specific mitochondrial genetics in different spaces around the globe, and specific Y genetics in different spaces around the globe, but none of them have anything to do with your actual genes, right? So like we know now that it's not that Black people in the United States are more prone to heart problems because they are genetically Black. It's redlining that causes more prone to heart problems, right? We know that Turtle Island Indigenous people aren't more prone to diabetes because they're Turtle Island Indigenous. They're more prone to diabetes because they are fed highly processed food. So when we are looking at this becoming a part, right, of this space as being the only people, we've never been the only people. Our entire time has been with seeing many different morphologies, many different ways the body is built, whether it's the different curvature of the fingers and the toes, whether it's different nostril shapes, like ours are very narrow inside, whether our fleshy nose is big or not, the nostril opening is very narrow, whereas Neanderthals is very wide, right? We're seeing different prognoses are gone. We, up until this time, have not been the only species. We've seen species out there that have mid-phase prognosis or lower phase prognosis, right? We've seen people who look very different than us, and we've lived our entire life with people who look very different than us. And at this point, right, we're starting to see we're the only ones. And at this point where we're starting to see that we're the only ones, right? This point of starting to see that we're the only ones, we have this different concept starting to form. This is the point where we start to see anamorphism coming out. Now, anamorphism is recognizing ourselves in the animals and recognizing the animals within ourselves, right? So when you see that the animal spirit is within you and that your spirit is within the animal, that you are siblings, right? This concept is starting at this time. And this is in very big part because of the fact that up until this point, we have other humans that look different than us. Now we're alone. So how do we relate to that, right? We also start to see through this time period, again, 40,000 years ago to 30,000 years ago in Europe, the start of statues that represent things. We start to see what we know of as the goddesses, the goddess of Willendorf, the goddess of Brasumfi. These goddesses are our first statuette depictions of human life. Now, we now have one that is 40,000 years ago, so it predates our two goddesses that most of us know of. There are many goddesses, but those are the ones that are most of our thought processes. The anamorphic one that we see at 40,000 years ago has a lion's head and a man's body. So when we're seeing this, what we're seeing is this development of understanding of culture in a different level. I'm not going to deal again with your bullshit in my chat. It's just not going to fucking happen. This isn't the space for it. Period. It's easy enough to turn off comments. If you're not going to be respectful to my mods, if you're not going to be respectful to each other, and if you're not going to be respectful to me, then you can go elsewhere. Again, now that there's over 200 people in this chat, let me go over again who I am and why I'm here. My name is Witta. I am an archaeologist, an anthropologist, a historian, a healer, and a storyteller. I am globally mixed, indigenous, and that means to every part of this globe, including the space that I stand on. Okay. I have degrees in medicine and degrees in anthropology. I'm a disabled war vet, so I'm unable to work outside of my home. And so I utilize my degrees and my knowledge to come into TikTok to give people a base level education that they're not getting elsewhere, because I do not believe that this information should be kept behind a $40,000 a year paywall or gate kept behind languages and words that most people, even ones with extensive degrees, do not grasp. I have things in articles that I read where I have to look up every word in the paragraph or every other word in the paragraph. And I have an extremely extensive vocabulary, and I've been reading, I started reading in archaeology books. That's how I got my education. So I come in here to teach. I come in here to give a base level. I'm not giving you the be all and the end all. This is not something you're getting a college level degree. I have a website that I compile bibliographies of articles so you can take this knowledge and get further information. I am not here to give it all to you. Everybody should be digging for themselves, because knowledge comes when you actually put action into it, when you're actually doing the searching, when you're actually trying to find for yourself. We don't get knowledge just by listening to somebody. We actually have to put action into knowledge, right? So I have a website so you can go and find the start of all of this thing and dig deeper for yourself, okay? I come from the field, and part of the reason I entered into the field that created the theory of race, the theory of eugenics, and the theory of evolution. Now, I entered into this field because we have a problem within this field. There is a huge problem within academia, and an extremely huge problem within archaeology and anthropology. And as an Indigenous Turtle Islander, I knew of those problems. And so I came into the field to try and affect some change in the field. Not to work within the field. I wouldn't work within archaeology and anthropology in Turtle Island. We would like people to stop digging up our ancestors, right? Because of this, I am well aware of many of the problems and try and teach you where these problems are wrong. My field created the theory of race. My field debunked the theory of race. Race does not exist. It is a colonial construct created by Europeans to justify the atrocities that they have been committing. They have been basing the justification on their Bible, and when they couldn't base it on the Bible anymore, they decided to invent a pseudoscience to create that justification. The Human Genome Project, the Whole Genome Project, is actually what helped debunk the theory of race. Again, race does not exist. It is a colonial concept. And how it debunked the theory of race is because we know that there are more genetic differences between you and your next door neighbor in a primary population prior to colonization than there are between you and somebody in an entirely different primary population prior to colonization. This makes sense if you think about it. Narrow genetics means inbreeding and means problems within our species. And we're all very well aware of what inbreeding is. So if everybody in your population shares the same genetics and they're all breeding together, there's going to be a lot of mutations. Okay, so it's a logical thing if you think about it. Not only do we have the debunction of the theory of race, but we also have a lot of new knowledge within the field, Like I was just talking about, our speciation through convergence instead of isolation. The fact that there are three biological sexes, male, female, and intersex. Your phobias based on gender are wrong. You, first of all, gender is a concept within my brain of who I am. I personally am a two spirit before you call me a white woman. Neither white nor a woman. I personally am a two spirit. Gender is a concept within our own brain, and you don't get to define it for somebody else. I don't want to deal with your phobias based on gender. I also won't deal with your phobias based on desire. None of your fucking business unless somebody is harming another person, who the hell they're fucking. And I also am not going to deal with your phobias based on religion. The god of all of those organized religions is a narcissist. He's a warmonger. I don't want to talk about him. I don't want to deal with him, but I also will not deal with your anti-Semitism or your Islamophobia. Those are not acceptable behaviors within my chat. I am doing a kindness. I am here in love. And if you're not going to treat me in the same way, you can scroll the fuck on. And if you're not going to treat people in my chat with the kindness and love that I am trying to show you, then you can also scroll the fuck on. This is a safe space. It's not a space for your idiocracy. Take it elsewhere. You can either be the type of human that is curious, trying to find new information, trying to understand things on a deeper level, or you can be narrow-minded. Your choice. And I really don't care which you try to do. I do care what you do in my space with my boundaries. Those are my boundaries. This is my space. Keep your shit elsewhere. Now, when we see that the Europeans at this point in time, from 40,000 to 30,000 years ago, are in a space, again, for the first time as the only human within that space, we start to see this deeper understanding of that cross biome connection between us and everything around us. Now, of course, we had already at this point known that we were just another animal in the biome, that the earth itself has a soul, that all of the animals and the plants and the trees and the everything around you has a soul, has just as much of a right and a reason to be here as you do. We had already had this knowledge and this concept. At this point, though, we start to see us in other things. The reason that we're starting to see us in other things is there's no longer other us's to see us in, right? And we know that that connection is there. So this is a point in time where we start to see art and statues take on this anamorphic concept that humans and animals are one. Of course, there is not a concept before that that we're completely different. We're all on the same scale, yet there is not the concept of intermixing. When we see things like the anamorphic statue of the lion-headed man, this can mean several different things. It can mean that we have, maybe this was a specific individual, maybe he died, and after he died, they made a statue of him, right? Maybe they made a statue of him and he was somebody who had hunted mountain lions and had a cloak that he wore that had a hood that was made of the mountain lion's skull or head, right? And so maybe in making that cloak out of a mountain lion, this is what he wore around because he had killed the mountain lion. And hey, I'm really badass because I could kill the mountain lion, right? And this is a funerary statue. Maybe this is indicative of a leadership position. We know that the people who lead us are like the lion. They're strong, they're protectors, they're defenders. And so because of that, we visualize them as embodying the spirit of the lion, right? Female lions go out and hunt. Male lions stay home and protect the home, right? They take care of the children and they protect the home. So maybe we're seeing our leadership as masculine in this particular incident, and we're seeing that it's embodying the protection and defending of the masculine lion, right? Whereas the women are, and this has been proven, out hunting because women were hunting in hunter-gatherer cultures. So these are a couple of different concepts. Maybe it was an individual and it was a burial thing. Maybe it wasn't an individual. Maybe it was a positional thing. When we look at things like the goddess of Brassamphi and the goddess of Willendorf, we tend to look at these and think that these might either be something having to do with fertility, or they might be signs of midwives, right? So women who are going around and they're helping you birth your children, maybe they wear the headdress that we see that he's wearing here and what we assume is a headdress, but we're not exactly sure, on the goddess of Willendorf, right? As a sign of their position within society. And their position within society is to help in childbirth. Maybe their position within society is that they're elders and they're women who have gone through the change. And so now their position in society is to teach, because that is usually what women, after they have gone through the change, are doing within society, right? It's one of the reasons that they supposit that women actually go through of a change is because we're really the only species on the planet that has that postmenopausal time where women are still extremely active within community, right? So our goddesses could mean a few different things, just like our statue could mean a few different things. One thing that should be understood at this time period, though, is that this embodiment of the spirit of animals is really coming into forefront into play. Now, this can mean many different things. There are many cultures that believe that by eating the animal itself, you're imbuing that spirit within you, right? You're going to, first of all, make sure that you're killing things in a healthy manner so that you're not imbuing a spirit of pain within your body. And then you're also going to eat things that have qualities that you're looking for, right? So maybe you go out and you hunt the deer and you eat the deer in the thought process, the swiftness of the deer is something that you're trying to get within you. Excuse me. So as we're seeing this understanding of anamorphism really become apparent, it doesn't mean that it's not there before. It's just becoming apparent, right? Because now we're starting to create statues. Now we're starting to draw these things differently, right? As we see this concept of anamorphism becoming apparent, what we see is the concept of imbuing the spirit of an animal into you is becoming apparent, right? Now, we've talked before in here a couple of times, and we're going to talk about it again, about becoming indigenous to this space. So Europeans at this time period, again, are entering into a period of time when they're the only humans left. Up until this time, they're not the only humans. There are so many different humans, and they fuck everything they see that looks different because we like things that look different in our bed. Just how we like to have kids, we like things that look different. So this is a time period where they are becoming the only, and this is a new concept for them, right? They are moving into space that there are not other people a part of, so they're not becoming a part of a different culture. Again, migration, immigration, and colonization being three different things. So they are migrating into a space at this point in time because the other humans that were in that space, Homo Neanderthal, are no longer in that space. They're migrating into this space. And as they're migrating into this space, they're becoming indigenous to space. Now, how do people become indigenous to space? This is an extremely important understanding. People become indigenous to space when they are sinking into that space, where they are learning about being a part of that space. Now, this comes in many different ways. Generally, it comes first in the way you're interacting to live, right? So the foods that you eat, the tools that you make, and the homes that you make, right? Because as you go from along the Mediterranean basin, where maybe you have a lot of sea life in your diet, and maybe you use whale bones to build your house, and maybe you stack some whale bones up and make this little dome thing, and you put some seaweed that's large and flat over the cross and over across it, and it dries out and makes a nice little dome that has a roof that keeps you safe and keeps you protected. And then now you no longer have whale bones or seaweed or the sea life that you've been utilizing to eat because you're moving up into the mountains. So now what do you do when you no longer have the things that you've been utilizing for your entire life, and there's something new that you have to utilize? So maybe instead of utilizing sea life in your diet, you're utilizing red meat in your diet. Now you're hunting more deer. Now, you've been using palm trees to create your spears this entire time. Palm trees are really flexible. And palm trees, when they create a spear, they kind of have a little bit of a wobble to them, right? So now you have to learn how to throw a spear differently, because when you're throwing the spear that has a little bit of wobble to it, you have to throw it differently than you throw a spear that doesn't have any give to it, right? Maybe instead of using palm trees for your spears, you're using oak for your spear. And oak is an extremely hard thing. It's a really great thing to use for spears and that concept, and yet it has no give to it. So it might break a lot easier if it hits the wrong thing. So now you have to learn how to hunt differently with this different material in your spear, right? Maybe instead of using whale bones as the ability to make the bones of your shelter, right? You have to utilize trees to make the bones of your shelter. So you're concept of how to make these goes differently, right? Whale bones have a natural curve to them and they can kind of meet in the middle, yet trees don't often. Sometimes they're too straight, sometimes they're way too curvy. So now you have to utilize what trees? Which trees are you going to utilize? You have to figure that out and you have to come up with that concept. You're no longer using seaweed to cover the whale bones because you don't have access to seaweed. So what are you going to use now? Are you using ferns and layering ferns over the wood that you're utilizing? Are you using saplings and you're weaving walls? Are you using furs that you're tossing over and maybe sewing together, right? So now we have a different concept of how we build our shelter. Now we have a different concept of how we build our tools. Now we have a different concept of how we eat. Now, as we are doing this, we're sinking into this space. We're getting this interaction within the biome that's different than the one we had. Our languages are adapting and our ways of lives are adapting. Our physicality is adapting. It's not our skin or our eyes that adapt first, it's our gut. It's the way we eat. It's what we get out of the environment, right? It's, if you've gone from eating sea life your entire life to eating red meat, it's a completely different gut, right? It takes different chemicals within your body to break this down, right? So maybe you're seeing an adaptation here. So you see that the body is adapting, and that body adapting adapts to what's important first, right? So we're adapting the way we eat first. Our body is adapting to the things that we're eating. After we're adapting to the things that we're eating, we're starting to see that light eyes are coming in. Light eyes are in by at least 10,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago. And the reason, again, is light eyes is less condensed melanin in the eyes because your eyes are all about how much melanin you have. And that less condensed melanin allows more light through. And the allowing of more light through means that in a low light environment, you're seeing better. You need to be able to see the predators in a low light environment, so the eyes adapt first. We see that you can get vitamin D from many different plants, which is why skin really adapts last, okay? We also see that as you're becoming indigenous to space, your language adapts to that space. Your language becomes a part of that space. Now, as we trace languages, we can trace some of the oldest languages on our planet. A couple of the oldest languages on our planet are the Khoi language and Indigenous Australian language. We know that these are the oldest languages on the planet for a couple of different reasons. One, we know that the Khoi are the original population. All the genetics of the entire Homo sapiens genetic scheme comes within the Khoi. We know that and that does not mean we're all descendant from the Khoi population, but it does mean that they have all the genes of the human species within them, right? They're one of the oldest groups on this planet. We also can see that their language, the syllables within their language or the way that their language is pronounced is still very close to how we develop language. We develop language by what we hear around us. Everything on this planet has language. We just have syllabic language. But everything on this planet, from the trees that actually can speak, they have matriarchal clans in a forest nation, to the grasses, to the animals, everything has languages. And as we are developing language, we use the sounds of the nature around us to develop our language. We see this as well with Indigenous Australians. And we see that Indigenous Australians are the second oldest population on this planet at 70,000 years, right? And we also see that their language follows along the lines of development that is about being that intermixed with the world around you, the sounds that you're hearing in the world around you. So as we're developing languages, having moved from along the Mediterranean basin up into maybe the mountains, we're developing a language that suits that space. It interacts with that space. The sounds work within that space. Not only are we developing a language that works and interacts within that space, but we're also developing a language for that space. What do I mean by that? If I tell you to go and get the herb eyebright, you might understand just from the phrase what that herb does. That herb is an herb that you would use to wash your eyes if they're infected. If I tell you to go get the herb feverfew, you might understand why, because somebody has a fever, right? So when we see indigenous language adapting into space, we see that language describes the things within the space to such a detail that the singular word of that thing alone will tell you what it does, to tell you how to interact with it. I come from the Pacific Northwest. In the Pacific Northwest, in English, we have like 20 different words for rain. And this is because I can sit in my house and tell you it's sheeting out, it's spitting out, it's misting out, and you know what you need to wear. If I tell you it's misting out, you're like, I probably don't need anything on. Maybe I need something to wipe my glasses, right? Maybe I need something to wipe my glasses. If I tell you it's sheeting out, you're like, I need to put a hat on so that my glasses don't get rain on them, and maybe my wool coat, right? Or maybe my rain gear, right? You're not going to carry an umbrella. We only use that for protesting in the Pacific Northwest. We only use our umbrellas for self defense. Yet you are still going to understand that you're going to need to maybe block your glasses from getting wet or your hair from getting wet, and maybe put on a raincoat or something along those lines. Because the specific word tells you specifically what the interaction that you need to have with it is. So, as Indigenous language is developing in these spaces, Indigenous language develops to tell you exactly what these things do and exactly what these things interact with. We have had science and medicine since Homo erectus and Neanderthals. We find science as far back as Homo erectus developing the ability to use fire to cook their food, to give you the big brain that you have. You were created through science. It's just not the Anunnaki, right? You were created through Homo erectus's use of science. So we have science as far back as Homo erectus. We see medicine in Neanderthals going back 90,000 years. We have a full foot amputation in Borneo at 31,000 years ago, which as a radiographer is better than some of the ones that we have today, right? So we've had science and medicine for generation upon generation. So as Indigenous people or people who are becoming Indigenous to this space or moving into this space, they are taking that science and medicine with them. And in taking that science and medicine with them, they are utilizing that science and medicine to see what herbs in that space they can utilize for medicine in the future. Okay. And this is where herbs get specific names for the specific things that they are doing. We're also seeing that the development of tool and the development of housing comes about, right? Of course, we already have housing. We have a 500,000-year-old find of a wooden building built by Homo heidelbergensis that came out in the last 6 months. But this concept of, instead of using the whale bones covered with seaweed, we're now using wood covered with, fronds, right? These concepts and these thought processes are shifting to become right for this space. We are meant to tend the biome. Every animal, every plant on this planet, everything within the biome fulfills a niche. Everything within the biome fulfills a function, and our function within the biome is to tend it, to care for it. We are biologically nurturing and communal, and we are biologically creative. We adapt our adaptations. We're the only thing that adapts our adaptations. Other species on this planet will adapt their surroundings, create homes. Foxes have dens, beavers have their dams. There are other species on this planet that create tools. Corvids can create tools. Other primates can create tools. Ants create tools, right? We are the only ones who take those tools and adapt them further. We adapt our adaptations. And as we're moving across the planet, we're using the science that comes to us through Homo erectus, who also adapted their adaptations, to create new things, to adapt our adaptations further, to get from the whale bones covered with seaweed to a house that is woven, right? And as we're doing this, we also see that we change from having clothing that we've had since Homo erectus. You kill something and you cover yourself with its hide, you cut a hole in it and you put it there, maybe you tie it around your waist, to having what we call tailored clothing. Tailored clothing doesn't mean you take it down to your tailor and it fits you like a glove. What it means is clothing that is sewn together to fit the body so that you're not having these big gaps where air is coming through and cooling you off in a way that you don't want to be cooled off, right? So during this time frame, we are also seeing tailored clothing coming into being. This is a time frame from 40 to 30,000 years ago where we are moving into the European area, to Western Eurasia, where as the ice is receding, we are moving up. Now, at the very end of the Gravatian period, the ice starts getting heavy again and the Gravatians move back down. And then as the ice starts receding again, they move back up. There are three groups that are distinct that we call the Dervatian groups. One is in the Iberian Peninsula, okay? One is in the western portion of the Mediterranean, and one is right above the Italian Peninsula. The one right above the Italian Peninsula, when it moves back up with a different Y DNA. The mitochondrial DNA is the same, but the Y line of DNA is different, which means that there is an influx of men into this group before they're moving back up. So through these things, we can see how these cultures are shifting during this time period to become the indigenous Europeans that end up living there for several thousands and thousands of years. The Gervasian period ends at roughly 30,000 years ago. Some places it's 27,000 years ago. The Solutreans come out after the Gervasian period ends, and they come out in the Iberian Peninsula. So at the end of the Gervasian period and at the movement up within Europe, we are seeing the settling of culture. We're seeing the settling of understanding. We're seeing the settling of identity, and we're seeing the settling in space. I'm going to go ahead and open it up so people can ask questions. Before I open it up again, I'm going to remind everybody, my space is a space where I've already explained to you how the theory of race has been debunked, where I've already explained to you that we have three biological sexes and that gender is none of your damn business. It's anybody's business on their own self-identity, and that desire is the same damn thing. I've already explained to you, I don't want to deal with your God in my chat or your phobias based on your God in my chat. This is a safe space, and it's a space for education. You're more than welcome to tell me that you think that something I stated is wrong. If you're going to tell me that you think that something I stated is wrong, please tell me why. Don't just tell me I'm a liar, because I'm not lying. I'm giving the truth as I understand it. That doesn't mean that I'm always right. If I am wrong, say, hey, Witta, you're wrong about the Gervasians, because this website says that their dating is this to this, so that I can go and research, so that I can learn more, because we're supposed to be learning together, right? So I'm going to go ahead and turn the comments back on. If it starts to get nasty again, I'll turn them back off. I'm always over on YouTube as well, and you're always welcome to go over there and comment as well if you cannot comment over here. I'll give people a chance to actually comment. Thank you, Junkat. Thank you, William. The Inwita Ord right up here, the one that's right underneath the European Ancestry. So the eye shape within Asian people, you're thinking probably the most of that inner fold. And that's not just, it's not really Asian, like all of Asia, because they're like Asia goes from like the Arctic all the way down to India. That's Asia, right? So within Northern Asian groups, as well as within Northern European groups, as well as within Northern Turtle Island groups, there is a fold on the inner corner of the eye. This fold on the inner corner of the eye is because of the fact that when sun hits snow, it reflects back up. And so Arctic groups, when sun hits snow, they reflect back up, right? And so that fold on the inner corner of the eye, and I can never pronounce it right. And I know if somebody puts it in chat, I'll probably be able to pronounce it right, but I can never pronounce it right off the top of my head. Epicanthal, thank you. The epicanthal eye fold, which is kind of like this, comes in a little bit more, right? This is to prevent the sun reflecting off the snow into the eyes and blinding people. Yes, there are definitely people within Africa who have that as well. And one of the reasons with that is because sun reflects off of sand too. So if you're coming from a primarily desert population, especially a lighter sand desert population, because sand has different colors, right? It bounces back up off the sand into your eyes as well. And that's another reason for it. Again, it's really not within all of Asia, though. It's like the northern part because of the snow. So being indigenous to space has a lot of different things to it, right? So currently we have indigenous groups across the globe. There's not just indigenous groups in Turtle Island. There are indigenous groups in Europe. There's indigenous groups in Japan. There's indigenous groups in Africa. There are indigenous groups across the globe. Palestinians are an indigenous group. We have indigenous groups across the globe. You can't move into a space that already has an indigenous people, and your indigeneity, becoming indigenous to space, means their indigeneity isn't there anymore, right? You can as a people moving into a space where nobody else is a part of, or as moving into a space where there's another culture there and you become a part of that culture, become indigenous to space. You can't move into a space where there are people there that are indigenous to that space, and because you became indigenous to space, you're replacing their indigeneity to space, right? English is a bastardized language made up of 10 different languages. Nothing is pronounced correct, and most of the words within it are made up. But all language is made up. Every language is made up. It's all made up. Really. It's all because somebody told you that that's what that word means. Because of the fact that when people move into Europe, they're all dark of skin and dark of eye and dark of hair, or tightly coiled hair. Europeans don't start getting lighter of skin until way later. So Scandinavia was mentioned. Scandinavian regions are settled about 7,000 years ago, and they're settled by two different groups. One comes over from the steppes of Asia, and the group that comes over from the steppes of Asia, having lived in an Arctic area for a couple of thousand years by then, comes over with light skin and dark eyes. These are the Sami, okay? Another group comes from the southern part of Europe. And the group that comes from the southern part of Europe is dark of skin and light of eyes. And this is 7,000 years ago, moving into Scandinavia. 10,000 years ago, Cheddarman is in Britain. And Cheddarman is dark of skin. And the alleles are specifically named as sub-Saharan black alleles and light of eyes. At 5,000 years ago, Otzi, the Iceman, is actually what we would call brown. His alleles for his skin tone are Arabian Peninsula alleles for skin tone. They are Middle Eastern alleles for skin tone, right? So when we are looking at people's skin tone, your concept today of black versus white versus red versus yellow, right? Your concept that skin tones are these different colors, this is a new thing. The ideas are the differences of skin tone across the globe are adaptations to space. Those differences of skin tone across the globe change in different regions. You can look in Asia and see that people are extremely light of skin at the top of Asia and extremely dark of skin at the bottom of Asia. And this is because where they are on the space of the equator. You can look at Turtle Island, which is North America, and you can look at people in the Arctics and see that they are extremely light of skin, and people along the equator are extremely dark of skin. Yes, that's what I'm saying, that the original people within Europe are dark of skin, that the light of skin in Europe does not actually become something that is even half of the population until 5,000 years ago. Even at 5,000 years ago, we're still looking at darker scales, right? And again, it's a scale, right? It's not everybody is this specific skin tone. It's everybody is in the darker scale. It's not everybody is this specific skin tone. It's everybody is on a lighter scale. So it still varies. It's never like everybody's Northern European white, right? You are not people's father and mother. The genetic lines within people within Africa versus people within Europe versus people within Asia versus people within Australia versus people within Turtle Island versus people within Abiyala, those genetic lines are not the grandparents of each other. People who were in a space left that space as a genomic whole, right? So it's not like we left grandma behind and grandma, gave birth to our mother again, who gave birth to our, it's not like that. It is, if you think of a group of 30 people, none of them are sharing each other's genetics, 15 stay and 15 go, right? It's not like that. I'm not European. I'm teaching European ancestry, and I do have European ancestry, but I am not European. So that would not apply to me. It's a nice thought, but it doesn't apply to me. And yes, in other words, we are all family. We're all one species. We're all one race. I don't see why it's so hard to understand either, but so many people do have a problem understanding it. So many people also seem to want to equate it to mean like you hear a lot Turtle Island indigenous people are descendant of Asians, and they're not. We're not descendant of Asians. We moved through Asia, but we didn't leave our genes behind. We didn't leave our family behind. We took our family with us, right? So um, there is this concept within our brains that you're all the Quay people have all the genetics, right? That doesn't mean that Ethiopians are descended from the Quay people. The Quay people are their own individual people, and the Ethiopians are their own individual people. It doesn't mean that the Iraqis are descendant of the Quay people, right? The Iraqis might have been there longer then the Quay people have been down there, right? Because we don't solidify as a species until 150,000 or until 125 to 135,000 years ago, but we are already living in the Arabian Peninsula at 150,000 years ago. So before we become one species, we're already living there, right? So it is not that we are descended from each other, it's that we all have the same ancestry, right? When we trace it back far enough, we all come from the same ancestors, but we're not the same descendant from each other. Oscar, the Quay people, which is absolutely that word. That word is considered to be a slur, though, which is why I'm not using that word. Um, and no, not from East Africa. The Quay people aren't from East Africa. So you're kind of conflating two different things right there. The Quay people are from South Africa, not East Africa. Lovely to see you too. You might be thinking of the Yorubas, which are East African. West African. No, not even East African. Genetically challenged or geographically challenged. Khiosan, Khoisan. It's considered a slur by the Khoi people. It is a mispronunciation of who they are, and it's a European pronunciation. If you can't use the clicks, they prefer that you would use either Kwe or San. So lactose tolerance actually develops both in West Africa and in Europe. And this is because our first husbandry of animals that give milk and our first usage of things like cheese is in West Africa, not in Europe. We see our first instances of that in West Africa, and then we see probably 1,000 years later, it starts in Europe. And so you see that lactose tolerance develops from husbandry of milk giving or lactose giving animals, and that again it develops first in West Africa and then it starts developing in Europe. And so those are two groups that lactose tolerance comes from because of the fact that they develop cheese. They started utilizing cheese within their diet. Is that the correct spelling, Neil? I don't know of that skull unless I know of it underneath another name. Okay. Yes. So awesome. Thank you. This one is actually going to be probably it's another instance of Homo sapiens interbreeding with Neanderthal. We have several instances. We don't have a lot of like genetics from we have I call them hybrid children. It's on my website underneath hybrid children. There's a couple of different instances of hybrid children. This is an adult, so it wouldn't be underneath my hybrid children thing. This is that seeing the having both genetics from both different species, right? So having genetics from two different species within the same. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the father and mother were two different species. What it means is that maybe the grandfather was one species, and so you see those genetics coming down. The some of them, right? The Homo sapien traits would have come down. We do see that many Neanderthal traits do come down. That we have many traits from Neanderthal that we utilize today, just like we see that we have traits from Denisovan that we utilize today. Sapiens actually mix with everything they come in contact with. We don't get violent until 10,000 years ago. Before that, every time we see something new, we fuck it. We like to have sex with things that look different to us. That is really who we are as a species. Oh, you're new. You're interesting. I like that big nose. That's just who we are as a species. Every time we see something new, we fuck it. We're just like that. We actually, my professor of paleoanthropology would refer to us as admixture or us, right? Because we literally have admixture from we have 5 ghost species and then 2 species that we see within the there's no rape. That's not rape. That's not. It's non-violent, right? So interaction, like we're exchanging ideas, we're exchanging knowledge, we're exchanging tool usage, we're exchanging paintings, we're exchanging identities, we're exchanging thought processes, we're exchanging genetics. It's not, oh, me strong, you weak, let me kill you. That's not what it is, right? We are, because we come from speciation through convergence, we don't think of this idea of I look different than you, so you're bad. We think of I look different than you, so ha ha ha, let's get together, baby. Right? And that's really what it is. And actually, it is like Mecca in the ancient world. Really, we see that the Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula is where you see the majority of the mixing between Homo sapien and Neanderthal, right? War is a human invention, and war as a human invention is only recent. Peace is global. Peace is animal species are peaceful, right? Mm. No, we like to think of it as us but we like to think that we've always been violent and we like to think that we're always evil. Like we have this concept, and Christianity has really taught us this concept, and the racist structure that most of our systems are built on have really taught us this concept. But this concept is meant to keep you in check. If I can convince you that it's your neighbor that's the problem instead of the people that are trying to kill you that's the problem, like the people in control that are trying to maintain their power, if I can convince you that it's your broke ass neighbor that's the problem instead of them hoarding their wealth that's the problem, then I can get you to believe that, to attack them instead of trying to stop me from hoarding from you, right? Well, if I can convince you it's them, and I can convince you that we've always been evil, that we've always been violent, that we've always been self-serving, that we've always been these things, then you don't try and change it. You don't try to because you're innate, right? That's innately who you are. If that's innately who you are, then you can't change it, right? But if you understand that that's not innately who we are, then you can change it. But when we think that that's just who we are, there's no changing who we are, right? So if they can convince you that you're innately violent, that you're innately evil, that you're innately the problem, that you're innately this or innately something bad, then you don't try and change that. But if you can understand that that's not who we are innately, that we're not like that innately, right? Then you can understand that that's different, right? There is a huge difference between killing something to sustain your life, i.e., hunting, and violence. It is not violent to kill an animal that you're hunting. In fact, many times, and especially in indigenous communities and thought processes, animistic thought process, killing an animal is actually an act of love, right? Because of the fact that I make sure that I kill cleanly. I make sure that in my clean kill that I give honor and love to the animal as he is crossing over, right? I make sure that he is maintaining his space in this circle, in the cycle of what we're all doing for each other, right? So we don't see war really with an animal species. You might see that if there is an encroachment of humans and space is being condensed, that different groups are fighting to maintain space, right? And yet you do not see that they're doing that as a natural act. They're doing it because they're affected by humans. Any more than a dog is a natural thing that was developed through the earth. we developed dogs, so we can't look at the things that dogs are doing as a natural, animal thing, right? And again, the species that you see in nature that go to war are going to war because they're being invaded, right? Because they don't have space anymore, so they have to compete for space. If you cause that competing for space, they're not going to war as a natural thing. They're going to war because they have to, because you've caused the need to compete for space. Well, that's weird, Mateo, considering the fact that we see blue eyes in Cheddarman at 10,000 years ago. And we do not trace all blue eyes to Cheddarman. Protecting is not violence. Protecting oneself against something else is not a violent act. Cannibalism is not a violent act, right? A violent act is harming something else for the sake of harming something else. Cheddarman did have blue eyes, and he's 10,000 years ago, and we didn't all descend from him. Cannibalism isn't a violent act. The Donner Party did not kill any of the people they ate. The people that they ate were people that starved to death or died because of freezing. And so they ate dead bodies. They didn't kill the bodies before they ate them. Many groups of humans, many communities throughout history have thought that you should eat your dead because you imbue the spirit of your dead. That's cannibalism. And yet they don't kill their dead to eat them. It's a funerary ritual. Cannibalism is not an act of violence. Cannibalism is an act of compassion sometimes, or an act of sustainability sometimes, or a mourning act sometimes, right? So after 10,000 years ago, yes, people were eating other living people. Yes. Again, violence starts at 10,000 years ago within humans. And after violence starts at 10,000 years ago, there are extreme acts of violence, extreme acts of lack of compassion and love. There's a couple of different concepts of what changes at 10,000 years ago. There's a climatic shift at 10,000 years ago, and there's a thought process that 10,000 years ago climatic shift has something to do with it. What we see within the archaeological record around the time that we see that climatic shift is the start of, so monocrop agriculture had started along the Nile already, and it works really well along the Nile. It doesn't really work anywhere else because nowhere else gets that concept of refertilizing every year, right? Like, or not the concept, but nowhere else is refertilized every year, like along the Nile because of the floods. So we see that monocrop agriculture starts along the Nile, yet when they take in monocrop agriculture elsewhere, it doesn't work as well. We see that monocrop agriculture based cities start around 10,000 years ago. An ownership of land translating into an ownership of animals, translating into an ownership of other people starts around 10,000 years ago. And we start to see the rise of stratification around 10,000 years ago as well. And in that stratification, we start to see violence and we start to see othering. We start to see this concept that it's you against your neighbor instead of you trying to maintain and take care of your neighbor. Bye, Neil. Have a good one. Native Americans were not black. Yet Egil Skallagrimsson is dark of skin in the sagas. There are actually many people in the sagas who are extremely dark of skin at 1,000 years ago. And Cheddarman at 10,000 years ago is definitely black because that's exactly what the alleles say of his skin tone. So again, I have degrees in archaeology and in medicine. Native Americans are not Asian descendants. Native American ancestry is not in Asia currently. Native Americans moved through the lower eastern portion of Asia to get to Turtle Island at 54,000 years ago, and actually spent more time in Australia than they did in Asia. And Siberians have a backwards migration from Turtle Island. So the parent DNA is in Turtle Island and the daughter DNA is in Siberia. So it is not that we went from Siberia to here, it's that we went from here to Siberia. We are not descendant of Asians. Light skin exists before 1681. The concept of white or black as racial structures starts in 1400s, and it starts as a religious racial structure. That is what the genealogy states. We're not in Asia either. We're here. We're in Turtle Island in Abiyala. That's why we're not in the West Indies, is because we're here. That's just not how it works. That is why some people within Northeast and Northwest Asia look like Turtle Island indigenous people because of the backwards migration. I can do one on migration and haplogroups. I've done them before. It's just been a long time. Yeah, someone just said white people didn't exist until 1681, which is funny, but because academia is based on European thought process and it is so steeped in racial thought process and it's so steeped in racism still, right? It's so steeped in Europeans justifying the shit that they did because academia is still so steeped in Europeans justifying their atrocities. You see that there's not a lot of information giving out. And if they can make people believe that Turtle Island indigenous people aren't actually Turtle Island indigenous people, that they must have come from somewhere else and left their ancestors behind somewhere else, then they can actually justify the genocide that they've been trying to commit, right? So they're trying to justify genocide, basically. The YouTube is right up there. Nobody pays me. I'm a disabled war vet. So the Solutreans exist, but the Solutreans aren't who made it to Turtle Island at all. They didn't come across the land bridge. The land bridge is the last route of migration. And the thought process of the land bridge is not that people came from Asia to here. It's that people from here went back to Asia. It's a backward migration thought process. That's what the DNA shows. It is true. Thank you, but I've been studying this shit for 45 years. It is true. That's it. And not only that, but I am indigenous to Turtle Island. I've known our stories since I was a child. It is true. That's what the DNA states. That's what all of the archaeological records state. You realize that there was a species of Homo erectus descendants here in Turtle Island by the time Homo sapiens got to Turtle Island. We've been here for 250,000 fucking years. There have been people here in Turtle Island and Abiyala for 250,000 fucking years. And as a Turtle Island indigenous person, I carry the genes from a species that was here 250,000 years ago within my body. That's not coming from Asia, honey pie. That's speciated here. You can think it's a lie, but I've got the facts to back me, and you do not. That's true. Most people don't even read books. I do have the facts that back me. I've given you the facts, right? I do have the facts that back me. We're supposed to be teaching about turtle eye, or not turtle eye. We're supposed to be teaching about indigenous Europeans. That's what the conversation is, but people are taking it elsewhere because people always have to take it elsewhere. Yeah, the land bridge has been debunked for 20 years because I didn't start in academia. I'm Turtle Island Indigenous, and I grew up in Turtle Island Indigenous communities. And my first stories, my first learning, my first teaching came from elders. So, because my first teachings came from elders, I learned information that most people don't get. And because my first teachings came from elders, I grew up knowing much of this stuff so that when I read stuff from Europeans, I could parse out the truth from what was being stated by Europeans. Okay, so let me go ahead and do this again. Let me answer a couple of these. So, written word is not as factual as oral tradition, and we've proven that time and time again. We know that the Druidic oral tradition was actually more concise and truthful than the written word by the Romans at the time. Okay, so oral tradition is not a game of telephone. When I am teaching somebody oral tradition, say Druidic oral tradition, in the Druidic way of teaching, what they would do is teach you a 3-line stanza, and in that 3-line stanza, they would do it in a mnemonic or a pentam or iambic that was memorizable. Like it helped the memory memorize. And so I might teach you a 3-line stanza. The Gervasians are the first Europeans. The Gervasians are Black. The Gervasians are the ancestors of all Europeans today. And you're going to repeat that back to me until you repeat it back to me word for word, not changing it, not adjusting it, not making it what you want it to be, but word for word. Then once you have been able to repeat that back to me word for word, I go in for the next one and I teach you the next 3-line stanza. Okay. The Druids are the descendants of the Gervasians. The Gervasians are the ancestors of the Druids. The Gervasians are the ancestors of all Europeans. And as I'm teaching you that, you repeat the first 3-line stanza and the second 3-line stanza until you have them both word for word. Studies today show us that when you write everything down or when you can Google everything, you lose memory. You're not able to retain knowledge as easily because once you write it down, you forget about it. You don't have to memorize it, so you don't hold on to it. This is why, well, the Druids had a system of writing. Ogham is a system of writing that the Celts used. And while the Celts used a system of writing, they didn't put anything important in that system of writing because you would forget it once it was written down. So oral tradition actually has more validity than written history. History just means written story. Story, honey. It's a story. It's all a story. And most often, it is not written by the people who have the lived experience. It is written by somebody else about another people where they have no lived experience. So if I tell you that the Celtic people were across the entirety of Europe, I'm not giving you the true name of the Celtic people. I'm giving you what the Roman writers called the Celtic people, and the Celtic people didn't call themselves Celtic. So I'm not giving you the truth. I'm giving you a propaganda-based indoctrination. So there is more truth behind oral tradition than there is behind a written story written by people who don't have lived experience within the thought process that they do. This is proven. You can go and Google it. Again, Google gives you the ability to not have to remember things. So go ahead and find it. Okay. That is, and it is within all academic circles that do not have that bias that says that Europeans are the bomb, right? A knowledge and an understanding that oral tradition is actually very factual. It is not a game of telephone. So I don't trust academia as a Western standpoint. Where I am somebody who has degrees in academia, I don't work within Western academia. I have degrees within Western medicine, but I don't work within Western medicine because I know the faults and the failings within Western academia and the faults and the failings within Western medicine. Faults and failings that are not within Indigenous academia or Indigenous medicine, because Indigenous academia and Indigenous medicine aren't as egotistical and they're not spending all of their time trying to justify their atrocities that they're committing. Whereas Western academia is spending all of its time justifying its atrocities so it can make you believe that it is the pinnacle of thought process and civilization when they're dirty and backwards. Okay. Just to start off with that one, the Moors. The Moorish people are a time period of Islamic rule, right? And the Moors are a mixed group, right? Many people want to think that the Moors are all black, right? Phenotypically, what we would call black. They are not. The Moors are both phenotypically black and phenotypically brown, are what we would call phenotypically brown. Many spaces that are indigenous, or many communities that are indigenous to North Africa, are as light of skin as I am. Okay. And many spaces that we consider brown are just as light of skin as I am, or darker than we would consider them. Your idea that a space is only one specific skin color doesn't really work. And the Moors are not a space. The Moors are an extremely broad community of different communities of Islamic people. So the Moors invading Spain are not all black. They're actually a wide mix of many different skin tones. They're just Muslim. Some people who are Judaic are of European ancestry. This is the Akhenashi, which I'm probably butchering. Judaic line is a European ancestry-based Judaic line. Most people have a thought process that the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. The Israelites documented that for themselves. I do know a little bit about the Picts, though. Well, actually, I know a bit about the Picts. The Picts, I tend to talk about when we're talking about Celtic groups as a whole. It is important to note that the Y DNA within the Picts comes from Turkey, and that you can see that the Pictones on the Iberian Peninsula and the Picts in Scotland both come from a Y DNA in Turkey. And you can see the migration of that DNA as it migrates along the Mediterranean, stops in the Iberian Peninsula, leaves behind a group of people, and then goes up into Scotland. Anthropology is one of those things that in the last 5 years we've changed our thought process on almost everything in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we didn't believe Neanderthals could talk, and now we know Neanderthals could talk. Absolutely, September. No, we're currently talking about European prehistory, European Paleolithic. So we're not putting European interception into it. People were asking me about Turtle Island indigenous things, and I was debunking some of the myths of Turtle Island indigenous or of how we got here, right? But we are currently talking about Europeans and European ancestry. Okay, and I think that is all of them. So we were talking about the Gervasians from 40 to 30,000 years ago. The Gervasians are not the first first Homo sapiens within Europe, but they are the first Homo sapiens in Europe at a time when Neanderthals are really no longer there, or if they are there, they're in very pocketed space. Like I think the 30,000-year-old Neanderthal that we have is the last Neanderthal within Europe, is at the very tip of the Iberian Peninsula in Gibraltar. And so we're looking at a time period where the Neanderthals as a species whole are starting to disappear. Now, that does not mean that the Neanderthals are disappearing. The Neanderthals still exist within Homo sapien today. What it means is that you're not seeing an entirely different group of humans. You're seeing that there's a lot of intermixing in the groups that you do see, and that you're kind of becoming the only group of human within Europe. At 30,000 years ago, the Gervasian period ends. Now, it's important to note that when we call these periods something, it doesn't mean that they thought of themselves like that. 10,000 years is a long fucking time. The people from the start of the Gervasian period made things that the people at the end of the Gervasian period probably had no concept of how they were made, right? The lion-headed statue we see at 40,000 years ago, if it had been found by somebody at 30,000 years ago, they probably went, wow, the ancestors made this. It's like the pyramids. Like, the conceptual difference is so vast in a period of time. I want you to think of the fact that 10,000 years ago is the very first cities that we see built. That 10,000 years ago, from today, the Gobekli Tepe is 10,000 years ago, right? The pyramids are 5,000 years ago, right? So when you're looking at this, you need to understand that this culture is changing through that 10,000 years, that they're not going to recognize the end of this culture as the beginning of this culture, right? We, looking back, call them all the same culture. That does not mean that they thought of themselves as the same people or the same culture. After this, we get into a period of time where we start to see a few different cultures. At 30,000 years ago, we see the Solutreans, which was mentioned, which is just the descendants of the Gervasians on the Iberian Peninsula. And we start to see the Eurasians predate the Gervasians. They go Eurasian, Gervasian, Solutrean. Around 35,000 years ago, we start to see our first tattooing implements. They're in a cave in France, and this is a single point tattoo instrument that has been mistaken as a discard flake. Discard flakes are something that when you're making stone tools, as you're shaping the stone tool to prepare a core, you're going to take this is a discard flake, right? So it's something where as you're trying to shape a tool and you're hitting it with a stone, things are flaking off of it, right? You can watch different things on flint knapping and you can see how this is done. And so things that have been thought of as discard flakes are now being seen to actually have single points on them. The first one that we know of is in a cave in France at 35,000 years ago, and it actually has blood and pigment on it. I believe the pigment is charcoal. So we see tattooing start around 35,000 years ago. This is, of course, something that translates down into today. We see that tattooing is across all of Europe, across the globe, start at least as far back as 35,000 years ago. My time periods go from paleoanthropology to Bronze and Iron Age. So I'm going to skip a couple of 20,000 years because I don't study that 20,000 years. So I do not have the information that you're going to want for that 20,000 year period. It's just not my area of focus. My areas of focus are paleoanthropology, how we come together as a species, how our species is created, and our first migrations. And then my periods of time are Bronze and Iron Age, Northwest Europe. And the reasoning for this is because as a Turtle Island Indigenous person who grew up in Turtle Island Indigenous communities, who was also the descendant of a slave who had ran away in the 1700s, I studied those histories when I was really young because I was taught to look at my ancestors through my own ancestors' eyes. So I studied those things through Black and Indigenous eyes. When I was in my teens, and enough children told me that I wasn't who I knew I was, I started studying my European ancestry because I needed to know the other aspects of my ancestry. And Bronze and Iron Age Europe are one of those time periods where it's still very indigenous a thought process. And being an indigenous person raised in indigenous communities, I went to look for indigenous thought process because I was indigenous. So Bronze and Iron Age Celts and Bronze and Iron Age Scandinavians is really where my next period of time and shine comes in. I can tell you that as we're looking to getting to those places, we look at peoples like the Bell Beakers. And when we look at the peoples like the Belbeekers, we see that the Belbeekers are in three different locations, but their genetics are different in each location. So the Bell Beakers in the northern part of Europe, who are up near the Scandinavian region, are a different genetic line than the Bell Beakers who are in the southern part of Europe near the Mediterranean, and a different, both of them, a different genetic line from the Bell Beakers who are in Britain at this time. So what we're looking at is how culture can be in many different places with different genetics. The Belbeekers are a group of people whose pottery, we call them because they have bell-shaped beakers, bell-shaped drinking cups, right? They don't have a handle, they just have a little cup. And the shape of the drinking cup, if it's turned upside down, looks like a bell. And then they have specific markings on them. And so we see that the culture is in these three different spaces that are genetically distinct. Okay. So as we're looking at how time progresses, we're seeing that there is a constant movement, right? A constant overlap of territories and a constant movement through territories, constant trade routes, constant migration or immigrational patterns. And in these constant immigration or migrational patterns, we're seeing an exchange of understanding and culture along with an exchange of genetics. So if we look at the Bulbeakers having three distinct genetics in three different groups, we're looking at the mitochondrial lines and the Y DNA lines. That does not mean that out of 3,000 Bulbeakers in Southwest Eurasia, we don't have 10 of them that have the same genetics as the 3,000 bell beakers in the northern part of Eurasia, right? So a group comes from here and they move down there and they take the culture and they take some of their genetics. As a species, admixture is everything. We are constantly getting genes from something different. We are constantly mixing with something different. There's not a person on this planet that doesn't have admixture from another species of human, and there's not a person on this planet that does not have admixture from another group of Homo sapiens after there are no other species of humans. There is a constant flow of genetics. This makes sense if you think about it. First of all, like we were saying earlier, inbreeding is bad. We don't like to inbreed. We know it doesn't work well for us. And the other thing with this is, as a species, we are naturally curious. This is why we adapt our adaptations. We are naturally moving as well. We are a species that has what we call expedient bipedalism. There's not a whole lot of species out there that have this. That expedient bipedalism is what gives us the ability to move everywhere. It gives us the ability to go across the globe. And that ability to go across the globe means that that constant flux of movement means that there's a constant flux of genetics. Wow, that trader that came in today, did you see his daughter? Holy shit, that girl got hair down to her waist and the way it curls up and her curves. And did you see? She's got freckles everywhere. I haven't seen spots everywhere on any of us. How do you get spots everywhere? I want children with spots everywhere. I'm going to go have sex with her and have children with her. This is how we constantly are. Did you see them? They look so different than us. Let's go fuck. We like sex so much that we think that sex is the purpose of our species. Half the males that you know out there think that propagation of species is fuck, fuck, walk away. Pump, 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 dump, walk away. Half the males out there think that literally sex is what you need to propagate our species, not understanding that what you need to propagate your species is raising a child from neonate to adult, right? Not understanding that nurture is what is required and community is what is required. Half of our species thinks that pump, pump, dump, and walk away is propagation of species. That doesn't propagate nothing. We are so into sex as a species that we literally believe that that's all it takes to propagate our species. We've literally made excuses for us to go fuck everything. That's how we are, how into sex we are as a species. And we are completely into new, unusual, different, not the same. That is how we've always been. That's how we are today. Deny it all you want to. That is how we are today. Okay. So, because of that, we see that admixture are us. We are constantly getting admixture genetics from somewhere else. That gene flow is important. That gene flow is what keeps us developing as a species. And it's also what keeps us from speciating into different groups. It's also why race doesn't exist, because race as a concept is the idea that certain groups moved here and they semi speciated into another group. But because there is constant gene flow, we know that we are all one species with admixture from everywhere. Okay. So by the time we get to Bronze and Iron Age within Northwest Europeans or within the European space, what we're seeing is we've gone through a couple of things. These things aren't really happening in Europe, so they're not my European focus, but I am going to go over these. We went over them just a tiny little bit. We touched on them just a tiny little bit, roughly 10,000 years ago. We see that there is this climatic shift in the planet. This is the end of what they call the Little Ice Age, right? We see that the way the climate is shifting means that there are different spaces where we have always lived in that we can no longer live in. We see that because of the way the climate is shifting, we have to change the way that we're interacting with the climate. Now, we end up going with something that isn't that healthy. We as a species were created to tend this environment. Tending of this environment through honorable harvest means that you don't take everything. You don't rip the environment apart. You don't dig things out and fuck things up, right? Tending the environment means working with the environment. If I am pruning my roses, I take what's from my roses that I need and they grow back stronger the next year because I cut some of it back. And the same thing happens in tending everything. When you are tending, you take what you need during the period cycle where the plant is going into its hibernation phase, right? Or you take the elders of a herd or the weak and the infirm of a herd of deer, right? And in that, you're pruning what needs to be pruned so that the plant or the herd grow back stronger. You're not taking more than you need. Now we enter into a phase where climate change is causing this issue where we can't quite take what we need anymore. We can't quite tend anymore in some areas. In some areas, it's still working and it still works for the next 10,000 years in many areas, but in some areas, it's not working. So around 18,000 years ago along the Nile River, we start to see monocrop agriculture. And what this is they take plants that are already along the Nile River and they start to plant them in a specific place so that they can tend them and they can make them bigger. They take barley and wheat and they do their best to make them bigger. I would argue that even along the Nile, this isn't the healthiest way. And this is why I would argue that. Barley, wheat, and corn all start the same size. Barley and wheat are pulled from their space in mixed with other plant life. And when they're pulled from their space mixed with other plant life and planted on their own, all the nutrients that they get from that other plant life, right? Because again, everything in the biome has a niche, everything fulfills something, and everything interacts and nutrients each other. Everything fulfills a need within each other. So when you pull them away from the other plants that are helping nurture them, you take that nurture away. You take those different nutrients away, right? It does work better along the Nile because of the fact that the yearly flooding replaces nutrients in the soil. So unlike other spaces, it doesn't completely kill the soil. And yet it's still not its best. When you look at corn, you see that it comes from something of the same size. And yet when corn has been planted and tended in a way where there are other things within its planting and tending that encourage its nutrition and encourage its growth. It's not ripped out completely and put in a space all of its own. Corn is actually one of those plants that even if you are only planting corn, you have to have several rows, not just a single row that's really long, but several rows that are next to each other because they intertend each other. They give each other nutrients. So corn goes from something that's the same size as what wheat and barley start out as, this very small plant, right? This very small grained plant, to corn, because it is never taken from the other nutrients in the biome and put by itself. It is always still a part of the biome. The tending of corn within the biome means that it is constantly getting the nutrients it needs. Whereas wheat and barley being removed from the other nutrients in the biome and being planted in a crop isolated does not give it the nutrients that it needs. Size does matter. So we see that corn or that barley and wheat are being planted along the Nile in a space that, while they are being removed from other elements of the biome, might not necessarily be the best. They are still getting the replenishment yearly from the flood. Again, this starts at 18,000 years ago, or our very earliest evidences. They say that it's really taking off by 14,000 years ago. And we start to see farms doing monocrop agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, which is Iraq, around this time. Now, we see them along the Fertile Crescent. We also see some within the Levant area. It is all across this area, which at this point is much more fertile. Our first city that we have that is based on monocrop agriculture is called Angazal. Angazal is along a river in Jordan. Angazal lasted 300 years in its first iteration. Angazal is still there. It has been rebuilt several times. In its first iteration, it lasts 300 years. And what we know about its first iteration is in that 300 years, because they ripped out the entire biome and replaced it with monocrop agriculture and their herds up in the hills, that they caused climate destruction in that place. And it took several hundred years of no humans doing their monocrop agriculture in that space for that space to revitalize itself and return to where it was. So monocrop agriculture in its first instances as a sustaining thing for a city caused climate destruction. Okay. Now, around this time, again, we're seeing that there's a shift in climate. So people are deciding to move from what they've been doing with tending to creating a space to tend, right? And again, they're taking something from the Nile that works really well along the Nile, and they're moving it into different spaces, and it doesn't work as well in those different spaces, but we're tenacious. We hold on to it. The experiment has failed, and we're still doubling down. Around this time, because we've decided that we have to own this land to plant crops on it, right? Because we're no longer tending a garden that everybody can enjoy, because that's what we were doing before, is tending a garden that everybody enjoys. Now we own the land where we're planting our crops. At this point of time, that ownership of the land that we're planting our crops, actually, it creates a dearth, it creates a lack, okay? So we know even today, hunter-gatherer groups, the highest working, their workaholics are 16 hours a week. The average need of work to feed your whole community for a singular person to help feed the whole community is 8 hours a week in a hunter-gatherer society. And the reason is because when you're tending, food is abundant. You're not taking more than you need, so there's always enough. Yet when you're not tending, and you're doing a monocrop agriculture, first of all, you constantly have to work that soil. You constantly have to interact and work with that plant. You can't take a couple bits of it and walk away and leave it and come back next season. You have to completely be there 24/7, digging in the dirt, planting, weeding, watering, all of the things that you need to do from sun up to sundown, from the first break of frost to the first start of frost, right? So with this, we're seeing that the agricultural lifestyle, the change from not working a whole lot, the change from interacting in a positive manner, the change from having enough, turns into a time where you have to work from sunup to sundown, and it's hard labor, and there's never enough. There's just never enough. So you start to see that people are hoarding. We hoard because of lack. We see, like with the 20s and the Great Depression, people who lived through the Great Depression hoard food because they starved. Hoarding comes from a lack. When you are without, you hoard it when you get it, right? Because you don't ever want to be without it again. So we also start to see in this point of time, I call them our narcissistic God kings. This is this rise of God kings. This is this rise of people who are creating what they call civilizations based on their ability to hoard your food. When we look at our first narcissistic God kings written down, Our first god kings that we see written down are Sargon. And when we see this, what we see is like the sagas are the writing of oral tradition down several hundred years after that oral tradition happens, that Sargon is the writing down of oral tradition several hundred years after he happens. What we see with the story of Sargon, who was really our first god king, is that Sargon is abandoned as an infant, put in a basket to float down the river, and pulled from the river by a farmer, a sustenance farmer. He is raised with a lack of food and with hard labor, right? As an abandoned child. So Sargon believes that he is the child of a river god, and that's why he was abandoned, because the river god couldn't keep him, right? So he's a god king. Sargon gathers together people as a young adult, and in gathering together people as a young adult, becomes the ruler of a city, creates the city. Now, Sargon uses the most ancient form of what we call othering, othering, which we use today in many ways, to keep people in check. If I can convince you that you need to pay me all your grains so that I can pay my soldiers so that they can protect you from the barbarians coming in to take your grain, right? Then I can convince you that you need me and to give me all of your shit. Okay. So we see the start of hoarding with these early god kings. Now, if you just listen to the story of Sargon, you can probably see the cause of MPD that happens in childhood in the story of Sargon's childhood. Abandonment, right? The being taken by somebody and raised by somebody who is struggling. So you never have enough food and you're doing hard physical labor, right? And this translates into the idea that you are the child of a deity. This is MPD. Like, by definition, this is MPD, right? So when we see this, we see that our first god kings create these cities based on agriculture, based on almost like a mob boss protection scheme. Pay me everything you have so I can pay the soldiers so that they can protect you from the barbarians in the hills. The barbarians in the hills is our first othering. It's our first method of control. And this is our first idea of a stratified society. You have a king and a ruling class, and you have a peasant class who are working the soil for the ruling class, and a soldier class in between that's supposed to be protecting the peasant class from the outsiders. Well, instead, it's really keeping the peasant class down. So this translates later on into othering based on other cities. When everybody's in different cities based on agriculture, this city is better than that city, and they want to come and get your information and your knowledge. So we must wipe them out, and you must pay me to do it. After we see that, we see othering based on gender, which really starts within the ancient Greeks, the Athenians, othering based on women not being good enough, right? Women being weaker, and therefore, they're manipulative and there's something wrong with them. So you should not be listening to women. You should be listening to me. After this, we see othering based on religion when we see the start of monotheism start. We also see at this point of time holy war and genocide starting based on religion, right? After we see holy war and genocide and othering based on religion, in the early 1400s, we see that this religious thought process translates into a racial thought process. We see that it starts translating into a racial thought process when they decide that all the people within Africa and within the Middle East are people who are, well, because they're Muslim, there's something wrong with them because God chose the Christians, right? And so, I mean, at the same point, Christians are killing Judaic people. They're killing everybody based on God. And we start to see that they translate your skin color as meaning your religion at this point of time. So anybody of a darker skin color must belong to this religion. Just like we were talking about the fact that the Moors are a very visually diverse people, but they're all Muslim, right? So in the end of the 1400s, in 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, that genocidal drunkard who liked to assault 9-year-old girls, invades Turtle Island in Abiyala. He actually invades Abiyala, the Taino people. And in this invasion, he shows that the people of Abiyala are people who are so close to God in the way that they interact with nature and in the way that they interact with each other, that now we have to take it out of the religious aspect and put it into a different aspect. They use the Bible to do this. They use the thought process that one of Noah's sons is marked by having darker skin. It's Ham, the one that saw Noah in his nakedness, and therefore he's cursed. And so everybody who has darker skin is cursed by God. We see this thought process of othering based on race really kind of taking a big step forward there. And then as we see it translate down, we see in the 1850s that the concept that the Bible isn't the truth starts to develop. The concept that the world is older than 6,000 years, the concept of evolution. And in that, we see the concept of race and the concept of eugenics really start to double down. This is very much Europeans trying to justify the atrocities that they have been committing based on this for the last several hundred years. If the Bible didn't justify it, if God didn't justify it, now I have to figure out a different way to justify the genocide that I've been committing. And so we see that Europeans use the theory of race, which is a very pseudoscience theory. Like it doesn't use a whole lot of scientific tools, and the scientific tools it utilizes don't actually add up to anything when they test out phrenology, which is the study of the skull, or the decision that different races have different skull features, is complete bunk. It's pseudoscience. And so we use calipers to develop the theory of race based on something that is absolutely pseudoscience. And of course, we're using swaths of paint and holding it up and a pencil test through hair. So the theory of race gets doubled down as a scientific thought process to justify the atrocities that Europeans have been committing at this point. Today, we see that this is translated into othering based on immigration. You're not from this country, so we're going to other you, or houselessness. You have been exploited to the point that you can no longer be exploitable, and now you're living on the streets, so we're going to decide that you're the true evil in this country. We see that othering, though, starts at 10,000 years ago. At 10,000 years ago, during this shift from being tenders, being groups of people who are hunter-gatherers. Go ahead. My cats and my dog want their dad. He just woke up. Being tenders and being hunter-gatherers into a concept of societies based on monocrop agriculture, right? That stratification of society, that ownership of land that translates into the ownership of people, animals that translates into the ownership of people. All of these concepts coming together 10,000 years ago can also be seen as the rise of violence within the archaeological record. What we see is that prior to 10,000 years ago, we have about 2,000 skeletons or individuals within the fossil record. Of those 2,000, roughly 2% have wounds that could be attributed to violence. And what do I mean by that? If I see that somebody has a rock that is caved in their skull, I can't tell you if it was wielded by a human hand and somebody hit them with a rock, or whether it fell from a cave and hit them in the head. I can tell you that they were hit by a rock. I can't tell you how they were hit by a rock. So I do not know if it is something that is absolutely attributed to violence. It could be, it could not be. There is, at 30,000 years ago, a spear point embedded in somebody's thigh. Now, this doesn't mean that somebody else hit them with a spear point. This could be a hunting accident. This could be flint knapping, and you hit it wrong and it embeds in your thigh, and now you bleed out and you die, right? So it's not necessarily that it was wielded by somebody else who stabbed you purposefully. I mean, it could be wielded out by somebody else who stabbed you in the middle of a hunt, right? So it's not definitive violence. At 10,000 years ago, we see that not only does violence in the archaeological record become definitive, it also skyrockets. We go from 2% that could possibly be attributed to violence to 18 to 20% absolute contributed to violence, including our first evidences of massacres. One of our first evidences of massacres is in Kenya at 10,000 years ago. It's 8 individuals who have been lined up. One of them is a pregnant woman. They're all sitting on the ground. She has her wrists tied underneath her pregnant belly, and they've all been hit from behind. So this is definitive violence within the archaeological record, and we see this starting at 10,000 years ago. At 10,000 years ago, we start to see Not only is there definitive violence in the archaeological record, but there are inter group wars, right? We see that they're so our first writing is actually in caves at 27,000 years ago by Homo sapiens. There's evidence that Neanderthals were actually doing writing. We think of cuneiform as our first writing, and cuneiform comes after hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics would be our first writing outside of the art that we see in caves, or the possible right, well, not possible, but the writing that we see in caves at 27,000 years ago, right? So hieroglyphics comes before cuneiform goes. We tend to think of cuneiform as our start because cuneiform is an alphabet that is based on the syllable. Hieroglyphics is an expanded group of letters or symbols that can either tell you a syllable or a full word. And there is a mark near whatever symbol it is to tell you whether it's a syllable or a full word, right? A cartouche around a group of symbols denotes that these symbols together, they syllabic out and make a whole word together. Yet maybe there's a hawk that is in the cartouche as a syllable, but in its own thing, it means Horus, right? So hieroglyphics are just a name for a group of symbols that's over, I think it's like 30, over 30 is hieroglyphics, and whether or not they indicate a syllable or indicate a whole word, it shifts whether or not they do both. Alphabet is from 30 to like, I think it's 20 is an alphabet. And an alphabet is something that is only indicative of a symbol. The mark only indicates, not symbol, syllable. The mark only indicates a syllable. Runes are, I believe it's under 18, and runes can either indicate a syllable or a full word. So we look at cuneiform as our earliest writing because of the fact that it is the earliest that we have where it has an alphabet, so a specific set or number of syllables, symbols, and each of those symbols indicates a syllable. So cuneiform is starting roughly 6,000 years ago. When we see cuneiform starting, we start to see the documentation of wars happening. And this documentation of wars happening documents groups coming from different spaces. So there's documentation of people coming down from the European area through the mountains of the Caucasus region and across steppes from Asia into where cuneiform is, which is in Iraq, right? In the Fertile Crescent. And we see that there is a war starting, or different series of wars that start, right? We see them in different language groups is what they're documented as within the cuneiform. Again, we start to see this when we start to see cuneiform, but we do see these wars happening within the archaeological record before then. And again, we see these wars happening in the archaeological record with things like the massacre in Kenya. There's a couple of different sites where you can see a huge mass burial of people that have obviously been killed, right? There is a site in Egypt that predates 10,000 years ago, and I think maybe it's 9,000 years ago. Maybe it's not even predating 10,000 years ago, where you can see 21 arrow points and 2 skeletons that are buried together. These are some of our first instances of war and some of our first instances of this interaction of violence. These things don't start in Europe, right? They don't start in Africa, right? These things start in the Fertile Crescent, and these things start because of stratification. These things start because somebody decides that instead of being a part of a community that tends a specific space, I'm going to own this space and I'm going to prevent you from going into it so that you can't eat, right? And we see that they are maintained again by stratification and again by people who are trying to hoard, people who are trying to have as much as they can. Many people will tell you that civilization starts when you have an abundance of food and you can store food. I argue that civilization is truly when you have an abundance of food and nobody is starving in your community, right? We had vast civilizations here in Turtle Island where we had thousands and thousands of people living together and nobody was starving. The orphans weren't starving. The orphans had families that took care of them. The elders weren't starving. The elders were treated with respect. They had space within community. They had worth within community. Then they were given food, right? So I would argue that civilization is not when you have an abundance of food. It's when everybody in your community is fed and there is still an abundance of food. These are what we document through academia, through Western thought as the start of our first civilizations. They are also the start of our first mass diseases. They are also the start of our first plagues, because every time you put a bunch of people in a city, and this is well known throughout everything, throughout history, throughout archaeology and anthropology, once you put a bunch of people in a city, disease happens. Even today, even with the so-called advanced thought processes of waste removal, even today, disease happens in cities. When you look at pandemic spreads through cities. And it spreads because everybody is in a tight space, right? Everybody is lumped together. So they're able to not only contact spread, right? But especially in these early cities, there's no thought process of waste removal, right? And there's no thought process of like, if I'm storing all of my grain in one silo, if it molds, then that mold spreads to everybody, right? When Europeans arrive in Turtle Island, they document Turtle Island north to south, east to west as being an entire tended garden, beautifully tended, like you could walk along and pick the fruits hanging low from the branches, right? Tended garden, and they document the cities as being free of disease. And this is because though Turtle Island Indigenous people have vast, advanced cities, their vast, advanced cities are so intermixed with the nature around them that they do not have the need to have the waste removal that the Europeans would have needed. The Europeans at this point of time, though, are shitting in their chamber pots and throwing it out the window on the heads of people walking along the streets, right? So there's not a whole lot of cleanliness there. So cities from the very start are problematic unless you do them in a way that is actually integrated into the biome, that is actually being a part of the biome. My partner just woke up and I have been going for just over 2 hours. So I'm going to turn everything on for questions for just a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to say something else, and then I'm going to take off. Again, you can always go and follow me on the YouTube channel. The YouTube channel will actually alert you when I go live. So even if you want to watch me in TikTok, if you follow me over there, it'll tell you when I'm going live in TikTok. So first documented religion would probably be Egyptian, the first documentation of gods, because again, hieroglyphs predate everything else, right? Cro-Magnon is actually just the name of a skull. It's not an entire group of people, and the Cro-Magnon skull is like 30,000 years ago. So after the Gravatians were there, right? We are absolutely constantly gaslit. Not only are we constantly gaslit, we are constantly indoctrinated into a thought process that's extremely unhealthy for us, that's actually extremely bad for us. And we are constantly told that who we are is something we're not, right? That's a relatively recent one. There's a couple articles about it, but actually some student was going through some caves and saw symbols within the cave and went, that looks like writing. And so far what they found are basically dots and dashes that seem to be symbolism of like how many animals were encountered or what this space is. They're not very complex in their structure. Corn and maize don't actually, I don't have any knowledge or evidence of maize or corn being in Africa prior to 1492. I've never seen anything that shows that. Cro-Magnons are not older than the Gravation. Again, Cro-Magnon is the name of a skull, a specific skull. If you go and Google Cro-Magnon, you will see the skull. The skull actually looks like the leprechaun from Lucky Charms. It's kind of like condensed squat, right? But Cro-Magnon is actually just the name of a skull. It's not a term for who we are. At one point, when they thought that this skull was older than who we are, like then they thought that 30,000 years ago was way early for us instead of 300,000 years ago. They thought Cro-Magnon was early human, but Cro-Magnon is actually just the name of a skull. It is no longer a term used within archaeology and anthropology because the thought process that Cro-Magnon is earlier than the rest of us has been debunked. I have not seen evidence of a lot of mass unaliving of Native Americans in the Americas. There is, of course, the Mayan and the Aztec, or the Aztec Empire, which did uh, invade the Mayans. The Aztec and the Mayans are actually cousin groups, though, so we're talking about intergenerational warfare that is a constant kind of thing. But outside of uh, the evidence of the Aztecs, there is not a lot of evidence of mass um, mass burials or mass attacks. I do not know a whole lot about the Toltecs. I also don't teach Turtle Island Indigenous history. Absolutely. Very much like I was stating earlier, I do paleoanthropology. And then one of the reasons that I was asked to come into TikTok was because we have a lot of allies and accomplices who are European who are looking for ways to connect to their own ancestry without appropriating from other people. And so I come in to teach Europeans how to reconnect to their own ancestry. I don't teach Turtle Island Indigenous people how to reconnect. There are many people on here who will help you with that. I will, help people with a positive reconnection way. And I also don't teach African history either. There are plenty of people in Africa to teach African history, and there are plenty of other people in Turtle Island indigeneity who are part of culture keeping who have way more of a lane to teach that than I do. Bronze and Iron Age Europeans, yes, depending. So within the UN, Indigenous and Native are two different definitions. Sami are the indigenous people of Scandinavia. The Swedes are the native people of Scandinavia. Earlier, when I was talking about how Scandinavians arrive as two separate waves, right? One coming from the southern part of Europe, who's dark skinned and light eyed, and one coming from the steppes, who's light skinned and brown eyed. That Finno-Ugric group coming from the steppes, that's light skinned and brown eyed, is the ancestors of the Sami, and the dark skinned blue eyed is the ancestors of, say, the Swedish. So they arrive at the same time. Per UN definition, the Swedish are the native group there because they are the majority group who is as old as the indigenous group, and they formed the government there, and that government took over that space. So the indigenous people are the people who are been living there just as long, who have created that indigenous heritage within that space, but are not the overwhelming government within that space, whereas the native people are the people who are in the overwhelming government of that space. So native and indigenous is only the same thing in Turtle Island, right? Everywhere else, they're two different thought processes. So there are indigenous groups in every space. Cymry, or the Welsh, are an indigenous group within Britain, and the Kurnow and the Scotias are indigenous groups within Europe, or within Britain, right? Whereas the Anglo-Saxons, the Angles and the Saxons, are a Germanic group who came over and invaded the Celtic groups and started eradicating the Celtic groups, right? I don't think indigenous is really about binary with colonizers, but it could be. I mean, that does make somewhat of sense. Indigenous, though, to me, and indigenous by definition is really the group that is usually the original inhabitants of a space who has maintained connection to their original thought processes within that space. The Welsh, no. So Cymru has really always been within that space. There are many different groups of Celts that did escape the invasion of the Romans that went into Cymru, but that doesn't mean that the Cymru weren't already there. But they were cousins, right? Because they're all Celtic, right? So they're speaking like the Debanis might be going into Cymru and escaping the Romans going into Cymru, but there are already people within Cymru at the time. Did humans speak one language at one point in ancient times? If we go back far enough to like 125, 135,000 years ago, maybe not even then, right? Because we start as different things. We start as many different groups. Because we start from convergence and we start in three different spaces and then we converge together, right? There is probably never an original, only us speaks this language, right? It's probably always because Homo erectus has language, right? And so you got Homo erectus in the northern part of Africa, Homo erectus in the southern part of Africa, and Homo erectus in the eastern part of Africa. They're going to be speaking different languages by then, right? So, what I like to talk about, I'm not blackwashing anything, honey. Listen, if it's uncomfortable for you that we all start dark, then you need to go and check your shit because you have some internalized racism going on there that needs to be checked. This is really about adaptation to space. This is really about where we live at the time where we speciate. And if there's something offensive to you about that, honey, you need to first off realize white skin is not an advantage. Light skin doesn't help you anywhere except in spaces of low sunlight, whereas black skin helps you everywhere. Okay. And the idea that you're somehow superior or somehow inferior because of the color of your skin is so completely off base. It's just ridiculous. So if you have a problem with me blackwashing shit when I'm just telling you the actual factual truth, right? You need to take it somewhere else. Again, I do not deal with racism well within my chat. Race has been debunked. Race is a colonial construct made to fuck people over and justify European atrocity. And let me ask you, in everything that we've just went over, we've just talked about how people with lighter skin have caused all of the trauma, all of the trauma. They control you. They are where you got that start of control, right? The regions that you think of as lighter skin, they've caused all of the trauma. So, take it somewhere else. Just take it somewhere else. So, the image behind me is Gravatian, Europeans from 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, right? Opinionated bird. I had to report that shit. Take your ick. um, click language in indigenous African times. So click language is not only in Africa, we see it within indigenous Australians. And we do believe that the click languages or the languages that have clicks and trills, natural sounds in them, like environmental nature sounds within them are probably our oldest. Again, the Kwe population is thought to be the oldest population on the planet, followed by indigenous Australians. So the Kwe are the oldest, and then indigenous Australians are the next oldest, and both have clicks and trills within them. So let me go over what I really like to go over at the end of each and every one of my lives. Biologically, we are nurturing and communal. Biologically, we know that we're nurturing and communal. We know that we're communal because of the fact that we have what we call mandatory midwifery. Mandatory midwifery means that we have to have somebody assist us in giving birth to our children. The way that the head is shaped and the way that the shoulders are shaped and the way that the pelvic outlet is shaped means that we have to actually turn our children twice to get them through the pelvic outlet. And this is something that it needs help to do, right? And because of the fact that our children have 5 life stages from neonate or newborn to adult or full brain development, we see that those 5 life stages is extended childhood. We don't see it in any other species. The only other species that's had mandatory midwifery was Neanderthal, and Neanderthal had 4 life stages from neonate to adult. They're the second longest. Currently today, whales have like 10 years from neonate to adult, and bonobos and orangutans are like 8 to 9 years for neonate to adult, and elephants are like 5 years from neonate to adult, right? So when we are looking at that, we have 25 years from neonate to adult, 25 years from birth to full brain development, right? And this is because of the way our brains work. We have these extended periods of development of the brain from like birth to like toddlerhood, right? This means that we have to nurture our children. We also have things like the studies from the 1950s where they took two groups of orphans and put one in a room and the other ones in a room, or one group in one room and another group in another room. And this group they nurtured and they took care of. And this group, all they did was prop their bottles up. And this group died. This is called failure to thrive. We must have nurture and we must have community to survive as a species. We currently live in a time period where people are being told that we're not nurturing and communal, where people are being told that you should not take care of other people, where people are being told that taking care of other people, having compassion and empathy is actually something wrong with you. And because we're currently living in a time frame where the things that are very innate to who we are as a community are so stigmatized within our community, many of us deal with a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety. Many of us feel like we must be the problem because we can't fit in. This is a healthy response to an unhealthy society. Your depression, your anxiety, your inability to fit in is a healthy response to an unhealthy society. The society around you is sick. The society around you has something wrong with it. And you are having a healthy response when you are dealing with your depression, your anxiety, or your inability to fit in. And I want to remind you today, I want you to remember, if nothing else out of today, that you are worthy of being here just by breathing. You are worthy of love just by breathing. You are worthy of compassion just by breathing. And many of us are willing to give that to everybody else instead of ourselves. And I'm not saying don't give it to other people, but I am saying give it to yourself. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of compassion. You are worthy of empathy just by being alive. So I ask you today, if you remember nothing else, to remember to give yourself compassion and love and empathy because you are having a healthy response to an unhealthy society. Please give yourself compassion and empathy today. Walaikum assalam. Please give yourself compassion and empathy and grace today because you are worthy of it just by breathing and just by being alive. You do not have to be exploitable by somebody else to be worthy of love, compassion, and empathy. You melt faster than I do, John. I'm a war vet. I can guarantee you melt faster than I do, darling. Because you are worthy of compassion and empathy and grace. I'm asking you today to give yourself those things. It's hard to find them sometimes. And I'm asking you today to give yourself the grace of understanding that you're having a healthy response to an unhealthy society. Thank you all so much for coming in and listening to me. I'll probably be back in a couple of days. And I ask you, please take care of yourself today. You are worthy of it. You are worthy of it. Okay. Have a great day, everybody. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. Remember that community and nurturing is needed for all of us, including yourself. Bye, everybody. I love you all. Bye, YouTube. Take care.